Every single day of our lives, whether we are trying to close a multi-million-dollar corporate merger, buying a used vehicle, or simply deciding where to go for dinner with our family, we are engaged in the complex art of negotiation. Yet most people approach this crucial skill from a deeply flawed perspective, viewing every disagreement as a brutal, adversarial battlefield where one side must triumph and the other must suffer an embarrassing defeat. In their historic masterpiece, Roger Fisher and William Ury expose the immense costs of this traditional mindset, which they label positional bargaining. When you lock yourself into a rigid position, your ego becomes completely entangled with your demands, transforming a simple problem-solving exercise into a toxic clash of stubborn willpower that destroys human relationships and produces highly inefficient compromises. To break free from this destructive cycle, the Harvard Negotiation Project established a revolutionary framework called principled negotiation, and its very first rule requires you to completely separate the people from the problem. The authors remind us that negotiators are, first and foremost, complex human beings with deep-seated emotions, deeply ingrained values, unique blind spots, and an intense desire for personal respect. When we enter a tense discussion, we routinely mistake the opposing party for the problem itself. We assume their difficult behavior is a deliberate, personal attack against us, which causes our bodies to trigger a fight or flight response. The moment you perceive your opponent as the enemy, all rational communication collapses, and you stop listening to their arguments because you are too busy preparing your next defensive counterattack. Principled negotiators master the rare art of dual tracking, which means they learn to be exceptionally soft on the people while remaining ruthlessly hard on the problem. You must treat the human being across the table with profound empathy, absolute courtesy, and unconditional respect, even when their objective demands seem completely outrageous. By proactively validating their status and actively listening to their concerns, you completely disarm their psychological defenses. You transform the dynamic from a hostile, face-to-face confrontation into a side-by-side collaboration, where both parties look toward the problem on the wall together. Managing this human element requires you to carefully balance three distinct psychological categories: perception, emotion, and communication. You must actively put yourself in their shoes to understand the precise internal narrative that drives their behavior, remembering that a conflict exists entirely in the minds of the participants, not in the objective reality of the situation. You must openly acknowledge and discuss emotions without judging them, letting the other side vent their frustrations completely before you attempt to apply cold logic. Most importantly, you must stop talking at people and begin listening to them actively, feeding back their core ideas in your own words to prove that you genuinely comprehend their perspective. When people feel profoundly heard and protected from personal attack, their willingness to cooperate expands exponentially, laying the psychological foundation for a truly historic agreement. The absolute engine of the Harvard negotiation method is a profound, paradigm-shifting distinction that sounds deceptively simple on the surface, yet changes absolutely everything when applied to a live dispute. You must focus entirely on interests, not positions. A position is a concrete, explicit demand that a person states out loud. It is the specific solution they have decided to fight for. An interest, however, is the hidden silent driver behind that demand. It represents the underlying human needs, deep-seated fears, unstated desires, and core motivations that cause the person to adopt that rigid position in the first place. The authors beautifully illustrate this concept through a classic story of two people arguing in a library. One individual insists on keeping a large window wide open, while the other demands that it be closed completely. They bicker back and forth for hours, trading stubborn positions and offering various compromises on how wide to leave the crack, yet neither side is satisfied. The brilliant librarian enters the scene and asks the first person why they want the window open. He replies that he needs fresh air to think. He then asks the second person why they want it closed, and he explains that he wants to avoid a freezing cold draft that ruins his concentration. By focusing on their underlying interests rather than their stubborn positions, the librarian uncovers a simple, perfect solution that neither person had considered. She walks into the adjacent room and opens a window there, bringing in a rush of fresh air without creating a single draft in the main study hall. This simple story exposes the fundamental tragedy of traditional bargaining. When you focus strictly on positions, you are looking at the tip of an iceberg, leaving the vast majority of the problem hidden beneath the water. For every rigid position that exists, there are almost always multiple alternative positions that could satisfy the exact same underlying interests. By shifting your attention away from what the other party is demanding and focusing intensely on why they are demanding it, you unlock a vast, uncharted landscape of creative possibilities. To uncover these hidden drivers, a principled negotiator must become a financial and psychological detective, continuously asking the simple question, why? When an opponent states a harsh demand, you must politely ask why that specific outcome matters so much to them, or conversely, why they object so intensely to your proposed solutions. You must realize that behind the most aggressive, irrational corporate or political positions lie basic, universal human needs that are completely non-negotiable. These include the need for security, financial well-being, a sense of personal belonging, recognition, and absolute control over one's destiny. If you can design a solution that genuinely addresses these core needs, the other side will happily abandon their rigid fortress of positions. By clearly communicating your own deep interests early in the discussion and putting them on equal footing with theirs, you elevate the conversation from a superficial haggling match into a profound, high-value mapping of mutual needs. In a traditional negotiation, both parties enter the room under the paralyzing illusion that the economic pie is completely fixed. They adopt a zero-sum mindset, believing that every single dollar or concession gained by one side represents an automatic, devastating loss for the other. This mental blindness causes negotiators to rush to judgment, criticize every creative suggestion immediately, and look for a single, perfect answer before they have even mapped out the true complexity of the problem. Roger Fisher and William Ury reject this narrow perspective, arguing that the greatest breakthroughs occur when you intentionally slow down the process to invent multiple options for mutual gain before you even attempt to reach a final consensus. Inventing creative options requires you to establish a psychological firewall between the act of inventing and the act of deciding. You must gather the participants in an informal, low-stakes setting and launch a free-flowing, non-binding brainstorming session where all criticism is strictly forbidden. The goal is to generate a massive quantity of wild, unconventional ideas without worrying about whether they are legally or financially viable in the short term. When you remove the terrifying pressure of commitment, the human brain naturally enters a state of high creativity. A single wild idea that seems ridiculous at first glance can often be refined, combined, and mutated into a highly elegant, multifaceted solution that satisfies both sides perfectly. To systematically expand the available options, the authors introduce a brilliant four-step mental model called the circle chart, which forces your mind to travel through four distinct phases of analytical thinking. You begin in the real world by identifying the specific, uncomfortable problem you are currently facing. Next, you move into the world of theory, analyzing the root causes of that problem and diagnosing the systemic forces at play. From there, you remain in the theoretical realm to generate broad, overarching strategies and hypothetical lines of action that could theoretically solve those root causes. Finally, you jump back into the real world to translate those broad strategies into concrete, actionable steps that can be executed immediately. By forcing your brain to iterate continuously between the specific details and the big picture theory, you prevent your mind from getting stuck in a single, unyielding line of thought. Furthermore, you must actively look for opportunities to trade on differences rather than fighting for sameness. True win-win agreements are almost never built on perfect symmetry. They are built on the strategic exploitation of shared differences in preferences, risk tolerance, and time horizons. One party might value immediate cash flow far more than long-term equity, while the other side possesses immense capital but requires long-term strategic stability. One side might care intensely about public recognition and prestige, while the other cares strictly about the private intellectual property rights. By identifying these asymmetric values, you can craft a highly customized package deal where you give the other side exactly what matters most to them at a minimal personal cost, while simultaneously securing exactly what you need to achieve total success. Even when you apply the finest interpersonal empathy, uncover the deepest underlying interests, and brainstorm dozens of creative options, you will still inevitably encounter moments of raw, unyielding conflict where interests are in direct opposition. A buyer wants the absolute lowest price, while a seller demands the highest possible margin. A landlord wants a long-term premium lease, while a tenant requires flexible terms. In these moments of high tension, traditional bargainers default to a raw contest of endurance, trying to bully, manipulate, or wear down their opponent through sheer stubbornness. Fisher and Urey warn that settling a dispute through a naked clash of wills is incredibly expensive, leading either to a bitter, stalemated breakdown or a deeply lopsided agreement that causes long-term resentment. To protect yourself from this danger, you must firmly insist that the final agreement be judged against fair, independent, objective criteria rather than the subjective whims of either party. You must completely refuse to yield to emotional pressure, threats, or arbitrary deadlines, declaring that you will only yield to principle. If an opponent demands a specific price, you must ask them to explain the objective standard they used to derive that exact number. By grounding the discussion in external benchmarks, such as fair market value, independent expert opinions, legal precedents, industry standards, or replacement costs, you remove the toxic element of personal ego from the equation. The conversation shifts from an emotional battle of who can scream the loudest to a highly rational, cooperative scientific inquiry where both sides submit to the rule of objective law. However, what happens if the other side completely refuses to play by the rules of principled negotiation? What if they are infinitely more powerful, vastly wealthier, and fully prepared to use dirty tricks, deception, and raw intimidation to crush you at the table? This is where the authors introduce the single most powerful, game-changing concept in the entire history of conflict resolution: your BATNA, which stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Your BATNA is your ultimate shield and your hidden source of absolute power. It is the specific, real-world course of action you will take if the current negotiation completely collapses and you are forced to walk away forever. Many people mistakenly believe that negotiation power is determined entirely by physical size, financial resources, or political connections. The Harvard method proves that your true power is determined strictly by how attractive your walk-away alternative is. If you enter a job interview knowing that you have 2 other high-paying offers waiting for you in your inbox, your BATNA is exceptionally strong. You walk into the room with an unshakable sense of calm confidence, completely insulated from fear or manipulation. But if you enter that same interview with a mountain of overdue debt and no other job prospects on the horizon, your BATNA is 0, and you will be forced to accept whatever exploitative terms the employer dictates. Therefore, before you ever step foot into a negotiation room, you must expend immense energy cultivating, refining, and strengthening your BATNA. You must brainstorm a list of actions you could take if no agreement is reached, transform the most promising ideas into concrete, tangible alternatives, and tentatively select the single best option as your fallback plan. Simultaneously, you must do everything in your power to analyze and estimate the other side's BATNA, looking for the hidden vulnerabilities in their position. If you discover that their walkaway option is incredibly weak, your leverage expands instantly. Your BATNA is not an arbitrary bottom line that traps you in a corner. It is a highly dynamic, living metric that provides a solid floor beneath your feet. It tells you exactly when it is time to politely gather your papers, smile, shake hands, and walk out the door. By combining a bulletproof walk-away alternative with an unyielding commitment to objective criteria, you become a truly formidable, unshakable negotiator, capable of transforming any high-stakes conflict into a masterclass of mutual agreement, integrity, and lasting success.